So welcome everybody. I hope the quality and the sound is good enough for you today. I see some fingers going up, that's great. So I am not going to share much about where the COP is right now. We're going to share more about that later today, especially in the Global Social Witnessing session. But I want to go right in because I am so glad that we are here today with actually a friend and a colleague of many years, Sara Queblatin from the Philippines. And I'll just say a few words about Sara. She's an inclusive design strategist, very passionate about transforming the narrative of disaster risk reduction to design for resilience and regeneration. So this call also in a way builds on our call from yesterday about regenerative agriculture. Sara has a background in mental health and psychosocial support, eco-psychology, and expressive arts. Beautiful combination. And she applies this to a trauma-informed understanding of regenerative resilience, and especially her work with communities. Sara is a core team member of Permaculture for Refugees, so bringing the permaculture design to refugee camps, and is contributing to ways to decolonize permaculture. She has also worked with Global Eco-Village Network, and many of you know that I've been with the Global Eco-Village Network for many years before shifting to the Pocket Project as UN Advocacy Coordinator and also as UN representatives here at the climate conferences. Actually, we've been together at many climate conferences. She started the Green Relief Initiative in the Philippines, one of the most climate vulnerable nations in the world and her home country. And she's currently working on a passion project called Kalikasan, Living Story Landscapes, working with local culture bearers and creatives in designing places of remembrance, resilience, and regeneration in communities facing loss and damage from climate emergencies. Yeah, so over the years, I've followed many of the hurricanes hitting the Philippines in close communication with Sara, hearing about them coming in, hearing about them arriving, hearing about the effects on communities. And maybe that's where we can start, Sara, just firstly welcoming you. I also know that you've just arrived this morning from a long flight. So yeah, so how is climate change coming into the Philippines? What are the effects you're seeing? And especially how are the communities being hit by climate change and climate change disaster?
Thank you, Kosha. It's so nice to be here with you and everybody. And apologies, I'm looking at an opposite mirror, so I'm kind of strange looking. Should I be looking at there? Thanks for having me. It's again a pleasure to be with you at another COP, and in this topic as well that goes deep into the inner workings of climate change. And so our story, being the Pacific Ring of Fire, we're like close to the Pacific. We're facing several hazards, mainly because there's some social challenges of the country, so our vulnerability is higher compared to other countries, and also that our positioning is much closer to natural hazards. The storyline we on climate would probably be, instead of climate change, say climate emergency, and that it's already like probably way ahead than many other countries. So if we say like by 2030, there are many irreversible climate impacts, but for us, it's probably less than, earlier than 2030. A lot of the communities already face head on, you know, and every year it gets stronger and stronger. And the stories I carry are about communities really at the edge of their resilience. They kind of need to go beyond like what's the normal. We also see communities that are expanding a lot of innovations in a small way, but at the same time, we're trying to see it like how far can we hold on with the resilience. So we, yeah, I think there's so many news to share, to look up, but what I hold in my story is more of it is kind of it's not just the Philippines, but there are many countries who are facing the same collective challenge, like the many Pacific islands and Asian countries in the global South particularly are also facing the same. So yeah, that's our experience is multiple hazards of droughts, typhoons, floods, you know, and then it's combined with other factors like industrialization of agriculture that costs more, like, you know, and mining that cause more flooding and landslides. So it's also many combinations of that. So so yeah, that's kind of like the context we're working with. Many levels, systemic issues that are combined, and with nature as just natural. I would say it's a human disaster, right? Human caused disaster, with climate crisis being a human induced catastrophe. So but systemically, a lot of the relationships make it harder for communities to recover.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's good just to take a moment, because these are words that you have shared. And at the same time, what your words are pointing to are millions of people whose lives are deeply affected, whose homelands are deeply affected, and the ecosystems and the land that they belong to are deeply affected. And just the enormity of what your words are pointing to, if we just allow them to land for how does that feel in your heart?
Well, in this room of so many people talking about, thinking about, talking about, breathing about climate crisis, and it's the 26th year of doing so. And then talking about my country, my home, and belonging, a sense of belonging, also feels like what's new at the same time, but also like where can I source a deeper sense of hope every time we have to talk about our challenge. But I also see that hope is, you know, it's we take it moment by moment, and I think from people that I've worked with had to live day to day or every cycle of one typhoon to another. They take hope in many in small ways, like living from one day to another. And I just am thinking about how to weave that collective hope across many small things, many small experiences that people have to just experience in every bit that they can. So that's what I'm thinking. Like many people here, each person represents that tiny bit of hope, and then how we could collectively bring that together. Yeah, it's a very interesting moment to speak here because it's very public and lots of mind space, thinking about the mind.
Right.
But a topic that's very heart-based, so spirit-based, is so interesting to talk about in this.
And I think that's a deep part of COP26,
Yeah.
you know, that there's this crisis, this emergency, which is really a crisis of heart, a crisis of care, a crisis of global family and global belonging. crisis of humanity, a crisis of all life on the planet, and often it's discussed on a very mental level.
Yes.
And so that is also the space that we're trying to open here, that we can learn to come to it more with a fully embodied and fully hearted and fully spirited human beings, which is, I believe, part of the solution. And it's small, but yeah, and I know you're so much a part of this. So yeah, we could go different directions next, but I think I would just like to stay with COP26 for a moment and just ask you about your experience of how Indigenous voices and the voices of the climate vulnerable countries have been coming out in COP26. And especially here in Glasgow, because as we know, many of those people haven't made it here due to the COVID restrictions, the visa restrictions, just the, and also just how COVID hit economies. So just so much feeding into that, that we have the whitest and most privileged, even though there is so much diversity here, but still a very privileged COP26. But how have you experienced over the years the voices of Indigenous people and people from the global South coming in?
Yeah, I love that. I recall when we were at COP24 in Katowice, I think the Indigenous Peoples Platform and local communities were kind of like formalized. And I think many years of work from many people who wanted to lobby and advocate for that has been like, I think it's a success story, but of course, that's only one step. And I know this year there's a lot of support and funding and to push for Indigenous peoples to protect 80% of the world's biodiversity, to be the kind of they are in the front lines, they are the stewards, and to support them and enable them to be the main people really to lead this. And for me, locally, in my experience, working with Indigenous communities have been so enriching, because it's very humbling to work with them, because they have the lowest carbon footprint, but yet they're also in the front lines because they protect the forests, the waters, and they're kind of like at the edge. But they hold so much wisdom that they've kind of used that over time, that they can teach us. And so in our work is how do we bring out their traditional ecological knowledge. And so at the COP, it's very meaningful that we are now finally recognizing that. Although, of course, words are not enough. A lot of us also say that, a lot of these pledges, they're only pledges, but can you really commit to that? And I think representation is important. And that's why it's also sad that, the challenge, indeed, like you said, the widest and most privileged COP ever. And so I hope, I think being able to create a spaces for these stories to be heard, it's so important. And action and words, and then I think our hands represented by action and our mind represented by words are what we say and think, but without the hearts, to be able to bring them together. I think that's often missing in many talks. And I had this very meaningful conversation yesterday. I helped hold space for a gathering of on climate emotions, and just a small thing with a small gathering with One Resilient Earth, which is an amazing group that I'm collaborating with, working with the arts and science, and with ancient indigenous wisdom. And just hearing people talk about their grief and their challenge, at the COP. And these are people we don't even know, and just gotten to know because of the shared emotion and feeling. And I think when you say climate talks, it's often about talking. And for me, because I'm working with decolonization and bringing other forms of expression that knowledge and wisdom of Indigenous peoples are expressing. And often it's really not really verbal or written. It's about embodied knowing, or even verbal, oral, not written. And a lot of the ways we deal with change has often been based on a more logical and written, forms of agreements. And it makes me remember in the Philippines, I was part of the peace process, and I was helping like the dialogues and bringing the government and the rebel groups and the people to be consulted on the peace agreement. But at one point, when we were about to announce the signing of the resumption of the talks and the signing of the peace agreement, eventually was able to contribute to ways to invite Indigenous elders to help hold space, to remembering what is beyond just a talk, or and we brought in ceremony, we brought in that remembering of the sacred, like how is it to remember this land that absorbs so much bloodshed and absorbs so much generational trauma that is related to the conflict. And so it's the same level and the same spirit is how do we remember and use these spaces to, we're talking about the earth, we're talking about stopping the rain, we're talking about, letting the sun come out. And in many talks and many COPs that we're often together with, in my head, I always bring the story of how I've witnessed shamans and elders just use their prayer to ask the rain to stop. But here we are, like taking lots of carbon to talk about, and also contributing to that since I'm here, but we talked so many years to talk about how to stop the rain. But when elders can do it with just, prayer and ritual and just a remembering and deep reverence. And for me, if we are able to create those spaces when their wisdom is heard and that they have their voices are heard and shared and that validated as well. It's not just some declaration or some ceremony, but really say that it is measurable, it's impact driven, and it's showing that, it's proving that. I work with Indigenous communities. They are showing us that they have that knowledge, they can do that. It's just that because the situation is we've contributed to the industrialization of their ecosystems that they also tend to forget that, and our ways, how do we help them remember so that they can lead and enable that for them as well, so they can guide us.
Yeah, beautiful. So this is, I would fully agree that somehow, what you just called climate emotions, my sense is over the years, despite it being a very slow process, that there is a softening happening of the spaces and the communication at COP. And slowly I've watched more women move in, more Indigenous voices move in, more diversity move in, and more youth move in, and more practices of deep sensing move in. Yeah. So I think we're both part of that journey, which is lovely. And speaking about what you just shared, just going a bit deeper with that, you work on decolonization, and everything you just spoke is about decolonization. But can you speak specifically about how you experience our organizations, our realities, like institutions like the COP to be colonizing, and how decolonization would work? What are the steps that we take?
Wow, I'm very careful. I don't want to be like the expert on it because I'm really like on a journey myself, right? So
but you can speak from the heart. So,
good suggestion.
We're not inviting you as an expert. We're inviting you as Sara Queblatin from the Philippines.
Thanks, Kasha.
To share.
I guess my experience has to be, I think this past is about I use the two words restoring and restoring. It's like how
restoring and restoring.
Yes,
retelling the story.
Right. And apparently it's a good way for us to look at to a journey from how we restore first, and then we can change the narrative by restoring, because the first step is to really the acknowledgement and recognition.
Could you just ask her to speak a bit quieter or not? I just wonder whether it helps.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, guys. I'm just nervous about you not being able to understand, because sometimes it's really loud here. Sorry.
No worries. Oh, the girl behind. Okay, got it. I thought it's so different to the screen and the. I think a lot of it before we restore and change the story is to recognize what needs to be remembered and restored, right? And we see that in many of the movements now where the protection of the land is so important in many indigenous cultures, like the North American Native Americans are trying to protect their lands from oil pipelines and everything. And we're also seeing like a lot of the narratives in the global south are often like, you know, you have scientists who are from this part of the world, but they're not really well documented and recognized, but they contribute so much to the climate science and other, you know, and there's also this experience where I guess many systems that are set up for change, and we were talking about this morning with Anna, and there's so much funding that are really a bit mistrusting, you know, of the global south, because you have to like fill out so many forms and systems, and it's designed from the global north perspective. But when you go into the field, you know, things change a lot, especially, you know, when we work with communities that are displaced, things change day by day. And so it's also about how can you create systems of trust, but at the same time, not at the same time in a way that it's a bit like I'm giving you money, you know, and you have to like work for me, but actually more of like, I don't know how to, I'd be careful to say this, but I'm kind of making reparations for the carbon we have, you know, contributed to this world,
Right.
or that the culture that we have influenced you through globalization, or that have, and how can we work together?
Yeah.
For me, I'd love to come from the common ground, and from I've worked in interfaith peace building for several years, and it's really about how do we work, what is common to us, what is important to us first. And so Restore is also like a dialogue platform for ecosystem restoration, because we're designing ways to, when you talk about the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, which is aiming for like, you know, hectares of land restored to address draw down carbon. It's also about what practices that are already in the place that needs to be honored, like the Aboriginal people, they have these practices of working with fire, and how do we honor that? Or that, how can we learn from the Paradise, the community in California that had their forests burned down and their homes burned down, and how can people in the Philippines learn from them? So we're trying to design these dialogues where many parts of the world are going through climate emergencies. It's no longer us in the global south. And that's actually more alarming, because that means it's going to be much worse for us. So when we see like Netherlands and Germany flooding, and it's like, wow, okay, that means this year our typhoons will be much, you know, maybe much harsher, or maybe next year. So so it's also like, how can we learn from each other, rather, and how can we unlearn together? And that's, I think for me, it's, but also there's both, because I know like one beautiful discussion I had recently as well with a beautiful amazing work of a woman also I'm working with on decolonizing, and she's working with the global north with remembering. Her name is Sara, and she's also spoken about how like the global north, like cultures have also had their own colonization history, and have had to forget their Celtic traditions. And so it's also about how might we help each other remember. It's not just like, well, you have colonized us, and so, but I don't know, really, it's not about who takes the first step. I think it's really about like, where can we connect first, like a shared humanity and challenge. And for me, working with the earth has been one way, because it's like we have a common ground, you know, we share the same water, share the same food or anything. If we don't focus on that first as our shared, you know, space to build on and draw this dialogue from, or exchange from, then we'll be coming from you know, our other stories. But if our sense of belonging is, you know, we start first where we belong together in many levels, place-based, shared insights, ethics, or values, then that could be one step, I think.
Yeah, and I'm just touched, you know, as you speak about also, especially the funding and how the funding moves, because right now We heard here that there's $135 trillion investments that is meant to move, especially also to the global south.
Yeah. Yeah.
In order to decarbonize, zero carbon economies. But if all of that comes with that string of power and instruction and system attached, I really get the recolonization that can come with that, a whole way of thinking, mind view. So somehow what you just explained, it definitely brought it home more deeply. Yeah, so maybe we just end. We only have a few minutes left, but maybe you could just share, what are your hopes for COP26? Maybe you go with your highest hopes.
Wow.
Your highest hopes. What's the best thing that could happen?
Interesting, because when I came here, I was kind of like, it's just my second day today, so I'm still adjusting. But at the same time, it's not new. But I think where we are now is, I think it's working on like first the immediate needs. So being able to, it's a very tough question, Kosha. Like, I don't know how to answer that. But
okay, maybe just take a moment.
Yeah.
And what would your heart say? Like, if you could dream into anything, what would you most love?
Well, having seen our work together in the last, many COPs and the communities we've worked with, like the Indigenous peoples, the local communities, the many groups that
I want people to really hear you.
Right.
Apologize for that.
Yeah. By habits, I just I think I feel, because if I'm thinking, it's really coming from my mind. I feel change cannot happen overnight, but what I feel is if we're able to kind of create that heart connection, the spiritual connection with everybody, and I think if they're able to carry that onwards when they go home, and see from a more connected perspective, because that's the good thing about being in global gatherings. You get to go beyond your country, and it's like you're like, oh right, if I do this, other countries get affected. So, and I think where there are ways to nourish and sustain on the long haul ahead, because it's going to be another year. I always mark COP with our disasters, because November, December is like our super typhoon. So whenever I'm in this place, it's like we're monitoring if like there's another one coming. And so for me, like, how do we prepare for the next cycle? If we plant the seeds every COP for new, for deeper connections. So we're meeting the same people from over time, and we're growing. And I think it's like a learning journey, it's not like, like you and I were, like now it's a beautiful position where you're in, and I'm learning as well with you, and I'm growing every time we meet. And I think it's those spaces where we can continue those beyond the events, and that could be sustained. I think for me, that's my biggest wish. It's not just the conference, that actually conference is brought with us in many levels, in when we go home or across distance and in time, I guess.
So seeds of heart connection that are so strong that they enable us to feel each other as one, and therefore go for true change.
Yes,
that's what I heard.
I like that. Yeah, that's a better way of saying it. Yeah,
thank you, Sara. And I feel like this is just the beginning of what could be a much deeper conversation.
Yes, I'm sure. Yeah.
And I deeply hope that you could hear some. I'm just going to shift once to gallery view, if you could turn your video on. Because I think Sara and I would just for a moment love to connect to you and see you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Yeah, much love, everybody. And we will continue these conversations. And yeah, also look at the challenge of how can we decolonize the pocket project. So let's take that home. Thank you, everyone, and see you again later today for the Global Social Witnessing session at 4 p.m. All the best.